December 18, 1944, Itazuke Airfield, Fukuoka Prefecture, Japan. The morning air at Itazuke carried the acrid smell of aviation fuel and machine oil as Captain Tsuruno Maso watched the early prototype mock-up of the Kyūshū J7W being wheeled from the experimental hangar into the pale winter light, its canard configuration rendering it alien among the conventional fighters lined along the hard stand. And he noted in his leather-bound logbook that the forward-mounted horizontal stabilizers gave the aircraft an appearance of flying backward, even while stationary on the tarmac. The Shinden program had originated from a desperation born of numbers. Since June, the B-29 Superfortresses had been operating with near impunity at altitudes exceeding 9,000 meters, well beyond the effective ceiling of most Imperial Japanese Army Air Force interceptors, and the Boeing bombers had already reduced sections of Kyūshū's industrial capacity to rubble with their M69 incendiary clusters and Type 98 high-explosive ordnance. Commander Ishikawa of the Koku Honbu Technical Evaluation Section had briefed the design team 3 months prior at the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal, explaining that conventional pusher propeller fighters had proven inadequate, and that Captain Tsuruno, formerly of the 302nd Kokutai Night Fighter Unit, would serve as primary test evaluator for whatever prototype the Kyūshū Hikoki Kabushi Kaisha could produce. The blueprints showed a single-seat interceptor powered by a Mitsubishi Ha-43 18-cylinder radial engine mounted in pusher configuration behind the pilot, driving a 6-bladed propeller at the tail, with 4 Type 5 30mm cannons concentrated in the nose to provide devastating firepower against the B-29's aluminum airframe. Tsuruno had studied the aerodynamic reports prepared by Lieutenant Iko, the young Naval Academy graduate who had spent 18 months calculating lift coefficients and center of gravity distributions, and the mathematics suggested the canard-design would provide exceptional maneuverability at high altitude, where conventional tail-heavy fighters wallowed in the thin air like wounded carp. The mock-up before him now weighed approximately 3,000 kilograms empty, and the wooden struts representing the forward wings extended 2 meters from the fuselage at a 10-degree angle, their hypothetical span of 11 meters designed to generate sufficient lift at combat altitude while maintaining goal authority during high-speed intercepts. Ground crew in grease-stained overalls secured the mock-up's wheeled dolly as a November wind rattled the corrugated hangar doors, and Tsuruno could hear the distant rumble of a formation of Kawasaki Ki-61 Hyans returning from a failed intercept mission over the Bungo Channel, their ammunition expended and fuel tanks running dry, another testimony to the inadequacy of current defensive capabilities. The design specifications called for a maximum speed of 750 kilometers per hour at 9,000 meters altitude, which would theoretically place the Shinden on equal footing with the B-29's cruising speed at operational height, and the concentrated nose armament meant that a 2-second burst from optimal range could deliver 120 rounds of 30mm explosive shells into a target zone measuring 3 meters across, enough to sever a Superfortress wing spar or detonate a bomb bay. Tsuruno had flown 42 combat sorties in the Nakajima J1N Gecko night fighter before his transfer to the experimental program, and he understood that intercepting the silver bombers required not just speed and altitude performance, but also the ability to maintain stable gun platforms in the turbulent air at high altitude, where oxygen deprivation dulled reflexes and froze hydraulic systems. The Shinden's unusual configuration placed the propeller wash behind the main wings rather than flowing over them, which meant cleaner airflow over the control surfaces and potentially superior handling characteristics, though no one had yet flown such a design at combat velocities, and the risk of catastrophic tail failure remained a concern documented in red ink throughout Lieutenant Ito's engineering notebooks. Commander Ishikawa had authorized construction of 2 flying prototypes and 3 static test airframes, with the first prototype scheduled for taxi tests in August 1945 if materials could be secured from the shrinking industrial base. But the strategic situation had deteriorated faster than anyone anticipated in December 1944, with American submarines strangling the supply lines that brought rubber, aluminum, and high-grade steel from the southern resource zone. Tsuruno closed his logbook and walked around the mock-up, his boots crunching on frost-covered concrete, noting how the forward canards would generate vortices that could either stabilize or destabilize the main wing, depending on angle of attack. And he made a mental note to request wind tunnel time at the Nakajima facility in Musashino if the B-29s had not already reduced it to smoking wreckage. The morning sun broke through low clouds and illuminated the mock-up's wooden skeleton, casting shadows across the airfield where mechanics were already preparing for the day's maintenance operations. And somewhere to the south, Tsuruno could hear the air raid sirens beginning their mournful wail as radar stations detected another incoming formation, the sound a reminder that time was running out and the Shinden remained nothing more than plywood and hope and advanced mathematics, while overhead, the superfortresses continued their methodical destruction of an empire that had once believed itself invincible. August 3, 1945, Mushiroda Airfield, Fukuoka Prefecture, Japan. The first prototype of the Kyūshū J7W Shinden sat in the morning humidity outside the assembly hangar at Mushiroda, its green-gray camouflage paint still wet in places where touch-up work had been completed the previous evening. And Captain Tsuruno completed his pre-flight inspection by running his hand along the canard's leading edge, feeling the smoothness of the metal skin that had been hand-formed by craftsmen working under blackout conditions in workshops that rattled with each passing B-29 raid. The Mitsubishi Ha-4342 engine had been installed 4 days earlier after delays caused by American submarine interdiction of the transport ship carrying the power plant from Nagoya. And Chief Mechanic Warrant Officer Nakamura reported that the 18 cylinders had undergone 40 hours of ground testing with acceptable oil pressure and cylinder head temperatures, though replacement parts remained scarce, and any mechanical failure during flight testing could ground the program indefinitely. Lieutenant Ito stood beside the portable wind measurement station, recording surface wind velocity at 8 knots from the northeast, favorable conditions for the first taxi test that would evaluate ground handling characteristics and brake effectiveness before any attempt at actual flight, and the young engineer's hands trembled slightly as he made notations on his clipboard, aware that 7 months of intensive development now concentrated into this single morning's evaluation. The propeller measured 3.1 meters in diameter with 6 broad blades designed by Sumitomo engineers to convert the Ha-43's 2,000 horsepower into thrust even in the thin air above 9,000 meters, and the reduction gearbox behind the pilot's armored seat produced a distinctive mechanical whine that carried across the hardstand, where ground personnel maintained a safe distance from the prototype's anticipated test path. Tsuruno settled into the cockpit and found the layout cramped but functional, with the reflector gun sight mounted directly ahead and the throttle quadrant positioned naturally for his left hand, while his right would control the center-mounted control column that operated the canard elevators and wing-mounted ailerons through a system of cables and pulleys inspected twice daily for wear. The instrument panel displayed basic flight indicators including airspeed, altitude, manifold pressure, and engine temperature, along with a fuel gauge showing the internal tanks held sufficient gasoline for approximately 45 minutes of flight at combat power, though this first ground test would consume perhaps 5 minutes of fuel during taxi operations. Commander Ishikawa observed from the operations building 300 meters distant, his binoculars tracking the prototype as Tsuruno began the engine start sequence, first engaging the battery power, then activating the fuel pump, then pressing the starter motor button that turned the propeller through several revolutions before the Ha-43 coughed blue smoke and roared into life with a sound unlike any conventional fighter, the pusher configuration creating a pressure wave that washed forward over the canards and made the entire airframe vibrate in sympathetic resonance. Ground crew pulled the wheel chocks as Tsuruno advanced the throttle to 75% power, while holding the brakes, watching manifold pressure climb to 42 inches and cylinder head temperatures stabilize in the acceptable range, the propeller blast creating a dust cloud that obscured the field behind him and rattled the fabric control surface on the rudder. Radio silence had been imposed for the test to avoid American signals intelligence intercepts, so Tsuruno could not communicate with the operations building except through prearranged hand signals, and he raised his left hand to indicate readiness for the high-speed taxi run that would take the Shinden to approximately 120 kilometers per hour, just below rotation speed, to evaluate brake effectiveness and directional stability. The throttle advanced smoothly, and the Ha-43 responded with a deep bellow that transformed into a shriek as propeller tips approached supersonic velocity, and the Shinden accelerated down the runway with surprising rapidity, passing 50 kilometers per hour in seconds, then 80, then 100, the nose wheel lifting slightly as airflow over the canards generated greater lift than the main wings, creating the unsettling sensation that the aircraft wanted to fly backward. At 115 kilometers per hour, Tsuruno reduced throttle and applied brakes, feeling the landing gear flex as deceleration forces loaded the suspension, and the prototype slowed smoothly without any tendency to ground loop or weather vane, returning to taxi speed within 400 meters of braking distance that Nakamura's stopwatch confirmed as acceptable for the runway length. 3 more taxi runs followed with incrementally higher speeds, and on the final run, Tsuruno felt the main wheels go light at 130 kilometers per hour. The Shinden balanced between ground and air for perhaps 2 seconds before he reduced power and settled back onto concrete. And in that brief moment of incipient flight, he understood that the aircraft possessed the performance envelope necessary for high-altitude interception, if only time permitted further development. The test ended at 9:45 hours when fuel quantity dropped below reserve minimums, and Tsuruno taxied back to the hangar where Nakamura's team swarmed over the prototype, checking for stress cracks, hydraulic leaks, or loose fasteners that might indicate structural problems, and Commander Ishikawa approached with questions about handling characteristics and system reliability, his expression revealing the weight of knowledge that American forces had landed on Okinawa 3 months earlier, and that invasion of the home islands appeared imminent. Lieutenant Ito calculated that 4 more weeks of testing would be required before the Shinden could attempt actual flight, assuming no parts shortages or air raid disruptions, and the first production aircraft might be delivered to operational squadrons by November if the Kyūshū factory complex survived the intensifying bombardment campaign that had already destroyed much of Japan's aviation industry. Tsuruno completed his written report in the operations building, while mechanics refueled the prototype and performed post-flight inspections. And through the window, he could see the Shinden sitting in afternoon light that cast long shadows across the airfield, a radical design born from desperation that might never fire its guns in anger against the bombers it was built to destroy. And overhead, a single B-29 drew a contrail across the blue sky at an altitude no Japanese fighter could reach, its presence a reminder that innovation alone could not reverse the trajectory of a war already lost. August 6, 1945, Mushiroda Airfield, Fukuoka Prefecture, Japan. The morning briefing at Mushiroda began at 0700 hours with Commander Ishikawa announcing that the Shinden flight test schedule would proceed despite reports filtering in from Western Honshu about a single B-29 dropping an unusual weapon over Hiroshima at 08:15 that morning. The details confused and contradictory, but suggesting destruction on a scale that made no tactical sense. And Captain Tsurano listened to the fragmentary intelligence while mentally reviewing the flight card for the prototype's first actual flight attempt, scheduled for 1000 hours if weather conditions remained favorable. Lieutenant Ito had calculated that rotation speed should occur at 140 kilometers per hour, with full aft stick applied gradually to avoid over-rotation, and the initial flight would consist of a single circuit around the airfield at 500 meters altitude with landing gear extended, a conservative profile designed to evaluate basic handling and control response before attempting more aggressive maneuvers or gear retraction. The morning reconnaissance flight by a Mitsubishi K-46 from the 81st Sentai had reported no American carrier aircraft within 300 kilometers of Kyūshū, and the B-29 formations typically arrived in afternoon when thermal activity made high-altitude bombing more accurate, so the window for test flying remained open unless the situation at Hiroshima deteriorated into something requiring emergency military response. Warrant Officer Nakamura supervised the final pre-flight preparations, his team checking control surface movement, tire pressure, and propeller blade tracking, while fuel bowsers topped off the Shinden's tanks to maximum capacity despite the increasing scarcity of aviation gasoline that had grounded much of Japan's remaining fighter force. The Ha-43 engine fired on the third blade and settled into a rough idle that smoothed after 30 seconds as cylinder temperatures equalized, and Tsurano advanced throttle slightly to clear spark plugs fouled by incomplete combustion during the extended ground operation, watching oil pressure stabilize at 75 pounds per square inch. Radio discipline remained in effect, but a field telephone connected the operations building to a temporary control position at runway's end, where Commander Ishikawa would observe takeoff and authorize the flight to proceed. And Tsurano tested the telephone circuit by clicking the transmit switch twice, receiving 2 clicks in return that confirmed communication. The canopy closed with a solid mechanical thunk that sealed him into the cockpit's confined space, where the smell of fresh paint mixed with hydraulic fluid and the leather of his flight suit. And through the curved transparency, he could see ground crew removing the wooden wheel chocks and giving the traditional salute reserved for test pilots about to risk their lives in unproven aircraft. Taxi to the active runway proceeded smoothly, with the nose wheel tracking straight despite a crosswind component that pushed against the vertical stabilizer. And at the threshold, Tsurano performed the final control check by cycling stick and rudder through full deflection, while Nakamura's team verified that all surfaces moved in correct correspondence to cockpit inputs. The telephone clicked 3 times, Ishikawa's authorization to proceed, and Tsurano aligned the Shinden at the runway centerline, advanced throttle to takeoff power, and released brakes, feeling the prototype surge forward with acceleration that pressed him back into the seat as the Ha-43 delivered full power and the propeller clawed at air with 6 blades spinning at 2,000 revolutions per minute. Airspeed increased through 80 kilometers per hour, and the canards began generating lift that wanted to raise the nose prematurely, requiring forward stick pressure to keep the nose wheel planted until proper rotation speed. And at 135 kilometers per hour, Tsurano began smooth aft stick input that raised the canards and shifted the center of lift forward. The main wheels lifted at 142 kilometers per hour, exactly as Lieutenant Ito had predicted, and the Shinden climbed away from Mushiroda at 300 meters per minute, the unusual sensation of flying an aircraft that seemed to be traveling backward, creating momentary disorientation until Tsurano focused on instruments and visual references that confirmed normal flight. Control harmony felt unusual but predictable,
with the canards providing pitch authority that required less stick deflection than conventional fighters, and lateral control through the main wing ailerons responded crisply despite the unconventional airflow patterns around the pusher propeller. The circuit around the airfield proceeded at indicated airspeed of 210 kilometers per hour, well below the Shinden's theoretical maximum, but appropriate for initial handling evaluation, and Surano noted that stability in all three axes felt adequate, though there was a slight Dutch roll tendency that might require rudder coordination during high-speed flight. Commander Ishikawa's voice crackled through the telephone circuit that someone had connected to a portable radio transmitter, reporting that additional information from Hiroshima indicated the entire city had been destroyed by the single weapon, and that casualties might number in the tens of thousands. But the test flight would continue because the Shinden represented months of irreplaceable work that could not be abandoned regardless of strategic developments. The landing pattern required careful speed control to avoid arriving too fast at the threshold, and Surano reduced power gradually while maintaining slightly nose-high attitude that kept the canards from stalling and dropping the nose abruptly. The throttle response showed a 1-second lag between power reduction and engine RPM decrease that required anticipation during the approach. Final approach speed stabilized at 165 kilometers per hour with full flaps extended, and the runway rose to meet the Shinden as Surano flared by applying aft stick, holding the nose up as the main wheels contacted concrete with a chirp of rubber, then lowering the nose wheel gently as speed decayed below flying velocity. The landing roll consumed 600 meters before Surano applied brakes and turned off at the first taxiway, the prototype having completed its initial flight without incident in 12 minutes of flight time that represented both a technical achievement and a strategic irrelevance. And as he taxied back to the hangar, he could see Nakamura's team celebrating with raised fists and smiles that would vanish when they learned the full extent of Hiroshima's destruction. The engine shutdown checklist proceeded mechanically. Mixture to idle cutoff, magnetos off, master electrical switch off, fuel valve closed. And in the sudden silence that followed the propeller's final rotation, Surano sat in the cockpit listening to the ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of field telephone bells ringing urgently in the operations building. Commander Ishikawa met him at the aircraft with a typed message that had arrived via telegraph from Naval General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo, and the text explained that the Americans possessed a weapon of unprecedented power and that Japan's capacity to continue the war had been fundamentally altered by events at Hiroshima, though no formal announcement had yet been made regarding possible surrender negotiations. Lieutenant Ito approached him with his clipboard full of performance data and questions about handling characteristics, his young face showing confusion about whether the successful test flight constituted victory or futility. And Surano told him that the Shinden had flown exactly as predicted, and that the engineering team had created an interceptor capable of challenging the B-29s at high altitude, even though history had rendered such capability meaningless. The afternoon brought a second test flight that reached 2,000 meters altitude and explored the upper portion of the flight envelope with landing gear retracted, confirming that maximum level speed at combat power exceeded 600 kilometers per hour, and that the concentrated nose armament would provide devastating firepower if the 4 Type 5 cannons could be installed in the second prototype, currently under construction. On August 9th, a second city disappeared under another atomic weapon, and on August 15th, the Emperor's recorded voice, transmitted via radio, announced Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration terms. And at Mushiroda, the Shinden sat in its hangar while ground crews drained fuel tanks and removed the propeller according to surrender protocols dictated by American occupation authorities. The prototype had accumulated 3 hours and 47 minutes of flight time across 7 sorties, proving that the radical canard configuration worked as designed and that Japanese engineers could still innovate under impossible conditions, but the war had ended before the Shinden could fire its guns or climb to meet the silver bombers that burned Japan's cities and killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Captain Surano filed his final technical report on August 20th, documenting all flight test results and recommending modifications for production aircraft that would never be built. And years later, when American aviation engineers examined the captured Shinden, they would acknowledge that Japan had created a genuine high-altitude interceptor that might have complicated the B-29 campaign if introduced a year earlier in sufficient numbers. Though such speculation changed nothing about the outcome of a war decided by industrial capacity and atomic physics, rather than tactical innovation. The prototype survived the occupation and eventually found its way to a museum where visitors could see the strange backward-flying fighter and imagine alternate histories, where the Shinden filled the skies over Japan and changed the final months of the Pacific War. But the truth was simpler and sadder, that the aircraft represented desperate excellence produced too late by a nation that confused courage with wisdom and paid the price in atomic fire.